Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Owen. I'm a first-year student studying government at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation online with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live and interact with our student-run Instagram at JFK Junior Forum for behind-the-scenes highlights. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Dan Balz, Astead Herndon, Josh Lederman, and Sean Sullivan.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. As you will see, there is one empty chair. Arlette from CNN is in a car. She was delayed, which is the plight of many campaign reporters to get weather delays constantly. But she managed to get her flight moving and up to Logan a little while ago. She's in the car. She will join us as quickly as she gets here, but we will kick this off anyway. I want to thank all of you for being here, but particularly our panelists. These folks have been on the road and on the run for a long time, and we're grateful that they could take a day away from the campaign trail and come here and join us for a good conversation. We are at a point that I think most of us did not anticipate we would be in. We've got a little bit of a race that has very few parallels. I was thinking about it this afternoon. After two contests, normally the field has shrunk considerably. That has not been the case this time. There's still 7 Democratic candidates who are in the mix and with aspirations either to get back into the contest or to advance what they've been able to do. Unexpectedly, Amy Klobuchar is up. Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren are down. Michael Bloomberg's waiting in the wings. Tom Steyer is pouring tons of money into Nevada and South Carolina, the next two on the list. The Democratic establishment is beginning to get quite nervous over the possibility that Bernie Sanders could end up as the Democratic nominee. We have yet to hear from African American voters or Latino voters in a party in which they play extremely important roles. Once we get through the early states, we have the roller derby of March, starting on March 3rd with Super Tuesday, when 14 states will hold primaries. We may be heading toward the first contested convention that any of us have ever dealt with. I've been covering campaigns for a long, long time, and it's always been both a dream and a nightmare to cover a contested convention, but with the help from these solid reporters, maybe we'll get there. Other than that, everything seems normal about this campaign. What I'd like to do is divide this conversation into two parts, at least my half of it. We're going to go for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you all for the questions. We have microphones in the usual spots. As always, we ask that you give your name, rank, and serial number, and please make sure that whatever you have to say ends with a question mark, and that the questions be to the point as much as possible. But what I want to do for a few minutes is talk to these guys as fellow reporters, and to get their political assessment of what we are seeing right now and where things may be going. But then I want to have a conversation with them more on the human side of what it is like to be out there, because there aren't many people who have spent as much time on the road as these three and Arlette when she gets here. There are absurdities to being on the road as much as they have been, and they see candidates in ways that none of the rest of us ever really do, and so I want to get a little sense of some of those things. But let's start. I want to start with just sort of the state of the race. You know, we've had two contests, irrespective of the particular candidates with whom you've spent the most time. Give me a sense of how it looks to you, and we'll just go down here. Astead?
Yeah, I would start with Bernie Sanders got the most votes in the first two states. And so I think the thing that is the most clear from the first two states is that he would be the national frontrunner at this moment with the amount of money that we know he raises, with the organization he has nationally. I think that's something that's clear from there. I think we have a lot of caveats that are added to that. It is not a mass coalition. He's not pulling in 40, 50% of votes, but one that's a smaller plurality. And what we also know is that the kind of moderate challenger that we were expecting hasn't materialized in a clear way. Obviously, that's been Pete Buttigieg in the first two states, but he looks less formidable in the states moving forward. Yet the Amy Klobuchar surge in New Hampshire, but she does not have an organization and not have really a pulse with non-white voters, even in the way that we've seen from Pete Buttigieg. Vice President Biden, of course, was supposed to be that kind of counterbalance to Sanders, and he has underperformed even what were already low expectations in those first two states, to the point that now South Carolina looks less clear today in the way that kind of might have been more unexpected. And so, and the candidate I have spent the most time with, Elizabeth Warren, hasn't met her own expectations, particularly in New Hampshire. So I think for me, it ends up to where you kind of started, where you have a kind of looming prospect of Bloomberg and that money coming on Super Tuesday. But most importantly, you have a national frontrunner that hasn't built a clear kind of enough of a coalition that would scare folks off, and you don't have a challenger that has emerged in a sustained way. And so while I think that can lead people to kind of pick an adventure of who you think can come out at the end, what looks the most clear is that we'll have a prolonged delegate fight going to the convention. I don't think that's inherently a contested convention, but this is going to be a situation in which candidates are trying to pick and choose where they can pick up the most delegates to get them to that 1990 number. But if I had to distill one thing, it's Bernie Sanders, for me, is the front runner, and the challenger to that is unclear.
Josh?
I think the most astonishing headline for the campaign so far has got to be the just utter failure of Joe Biden to launch the way I think we all anticipated. And Dan, you've written about this probably more eloquently than anybody. But that has been something that defied, a lot of the assumptions that we came into this with. And I think there's a lot of hesitation among the reporters who are covering this race day in and day out right now to make a lot of predictions and to feel confident in our own finger on the pulse of the race for a couple reasons. One is a sense of almost PTSD from the last election, where so many of the metrics that we used turned out to not, particularly accurately predict the outcome of the presidential race. So even as we're looking at, the things we normally look at, poll numbers, ground game, people are wondering if there's hidden elements there that is not, that we don't really have our finger on. And the other is that, we have a tendency to look at, particularly at a presidential primary in terms of lanes. You've got the progressive lane, you've got the pragmatic lane, you've got the moderates lane. And one of the things that we're consistently seeing and hearing as we talk to voters on the ground in these states is that it doesn't break down that way in terms of, people are looking at, okay, well, if Biden goes away, all those votes go to the other moderate, and that goes to either Klobuchar or Buttigieg, and if Warren, doesn't do well, then that all goes to Sanders. And we're not finding that that's the case. You've got Bernie Sanders supporters who, if they're not going to, if you ask them their second choice, it's Joe Biden, and you got, Buttigieg supporters, you've asked them their second choice, it's Elizabeth Warren, and so it makes it difficult to sort of predict what the next shoe to drop is going to be as we have developments in the race, like Deval Patrick, Andrew Yang, all these other candidates dropping out, and the race starting to narrow with the first two contests.
Yeah, I think two things stick out to me as notable about where we are now. One is, even though a lot has happened in the last year, this race seems just about as wide open as it did a year ago. We don't seem to have that much clarity, or at least not as much clarity as I think a lot of people thought we would have at this point, because you have so many viable candidates. And I think one of the drivers of that is that a lot of voters, I mean, the number one question that I hear from voters at these events when they're sizing up these candidates and trying to decide who to support is, they say, I want to find somebody who can defeat President Trump. And then when you ask them, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? They start to contemplate it a little bit and say, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. And I think for a lot of them, the answer is still, I don't know. And they're looking at these candidates. And one thing that's remarkable is that, the way that they perform in these primaries is shaping the views of a lot of voters. And you see that in the polls. You look at somebody like Joe Biden, who for a year was doing really, really well in the polls, doesn't do well in Iowa, doesn't do well in New Hampshire, and all of a sudden you see his national poll numbers drop. So I think it's clear that a lot of voters are looking at what happens in this primary, and they're saying, if these candidates can't win or at least place in these primaries, maybe they're not the type of candidate that can defeat President Trump. And so when you look at someone like an Amy Klobuchar, somebody like a Pete Buttigieg, who wasn't seen as a leading candidate or a front runner a couple of months ago, now all of a sudden they have this momentum because they're seen as winners, or at least people who can finish in the top tier. So I think that question is still unanswered. And I think right now, if you look at some of the biggest questions in this race, one is what happens with Joe Biden. Can he win in South Carolina? Can he come back? Can he steady the ship, or is this candidacy not destined to do well in this race? We've seen in past campaigns, winning can sometimes cure a lot of problems. If you can just put up a win, overnight almost, you can be seen as a different kind of candidate. And look at the way that Bernie Sanders is viewed now versus the way he was viewed a few months ago. Look at the way Pete Buttigieg is viewed. So there's a lot in the line for Biden, I think, in the next couple of weeks. And then what happens with him, I think, will determine a lot about what happens with the rest of the race. What does that mean for Mike Bloomberg? Does he come in? Does he take the Biden votes? So I think a lot rests on the future of the Joe Biden candidacy in the next 2 to 3 weeks.
It's an interesting point. Somebody reminded me this week that in 1992, Bill Clinton lost all but one of the first dozen contests and ended up as the nominee. And this notion of winning creates a totally different narrative, and clearly the Biden team believes that's what they need to do. Sean, let me follow up on something that Astead made a mention of, and this question of exactly how we should think about Bernie Sanders at this point. I mean, on the one hand, he's been at the top in both contests, certainly with the popular vote, dead heat basically on the state delegate equivalents in Iowa, but nonetheless, called a front runner in some ways, and yet he's in both states he's significantly underperformed what he did 4 years ago. He got 60% in New Hampshire 4 years ago. He got about 50% of the vote in Iowa. How do they think about that conundrum?
It is a difficult conundrum for them because on the one hand, it's a very different race. In 2016, it was a one-on-one battle. It was largely Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders, and there were a lot of voters who supported Bernie Sanders for different reasons. Those reasons were they didn't like Hillary Clinton, they wanted to see an outsider, they didn't like dynastic politics, and now when you have so many more choices, it's natural that vote splinters a little bit. But there is both good and bad for Sanders in some of these early numbers. There's no doubt that placing first in New Hampshire, sort of tying for first, depending on how you look at it, in Iowa is a good thing. But when you look at his coalition right now, he is carrying about 1/4 of one party. He's getting about 25% in Iowa, 25% in New Hampshire. Some of the predictions about high turnout, about expanding the electorate that he made early in this campaign have not come true, at least not so far in New Hampshire and in Iowa. And as we head into more diverse states, Nevada, South Carolina, places where non-white voters play a much bigger role, that's a big question for Bernie Sanders, and that was a huge liability for him in 2016, is that he could not win African-American voters in the South, could not compete among non-white voters with Hillary Clinton. He's taken some steps to try to improve that, but we'll see in Nevada, we'll see in South Carolina whether this candidacy keeps going or whether the coalition becomes smaller and smaller, because right now he is sort of leading the way, but it's not a dominant performance that we're seeing by any stretch.
Josh, there's certainly no candidate who's risen faster and farther than Pete Buttigieg. I mean, if we were sitting here a year ago, which would have been before the CNN town hall meeting that kind of popped him out into public recognition, nobody would have said that then a 37-year-old mayor of a small town who would be anywhere close to where he is. You followed that campaign very closely. Give us a sense of how they figured out what they needed to do, but more importantly, what they need to do now, and in terms of trying to make that pivot to get a different constituency than they've been able to get.
Yeah, I started covering Buttigieg in March before he'd actually formally entered the race, and there were a staff of 4 that was on hand for him. And to watch it, turn into this, really massive national operation has been quite interesting. I think one of the fascinating aspects of the boom, the Buttigieg boom, is how the historic nature of his candidacy has kind of almost been a non-story. I mean, we have not, we've not really had a national conversation about wow, an openly gay married guy just came within striking distance of winning Iowa, and part of that might have been the fault of the Iowa Democratic Party for leaving us with a little bit of muddled results on election night, but it's been a reflection of how the country moved so fast that what was seen as an impossibility 1 or 2 cycles ago, now it's not even really a primary thing that you're talking about when it comes to his candidacy. I think that there's something inherently technocratic about Buttigieg, and he hates nothing. I've never seen anything rankle him more than when people describe him that way. And he actually has this kind of explanation that he gives where he says he's actually so emotional and sensitive about things that he's had to suppress that, and that's why he comes across as being so kind of technocratic. But certainly that is, I mean, the McKinsey background that people talk about with him is certainly the way that he has approached constructing a national campaign. Going through Iowa and realizing that if you're going to place a finite amount of resources in Iowa, he might do better in conservative-leaning areas, in parts of the state that voted for Obama and then flipped to Trump, as opposed to the most populous parts of the state where a lot of the candidates spend the bulk of their time, and also the fact that the way that the delegate math is done there and the apportionment in Iowa is extremely complicated, as we've all been learning, that if you can do well in the less populated rural areas, you actually get more bang for your buck when it comes to delegates coming out of there than you do for the same proportionality in the more populous parts of the state. And I think that's emblematic of the broader way that he's approached, where are we going to stick our money, where are we going to put staff. The challenge now moving forward is whether he can overcome some obstacles that have thus far just been completely insurmountable. I mean, despite the absolute, what they see as their absolute best efforts, we've seen no indication that he has been able to improve, his standing with African American voters, with Hispanic voters. There's been a lot of commentary about, is he under a microscope on that issue in a way that, it's not like Amy Klobuchar is running around getting massive amounts of minority voters either. But there are certain structural limitations he's had so far that are going to become kind of do or die as we move in, out of Iowa and New Hampshire and into these more diverse parts of the country.
I want to recommend something for all of you who want to get a deeper insight into Mayor Pete. And there is an essay that Professor James Kloppenberg, who teaches in the history department, has written for Commonweal magazine. It's just been published in the last week or two. He taught Buttigieg here at Harvard at 2 different courses, intellectual history courses. Got to know him quite well through office hours. He said that I saw him last night, and he said Buttigieg was a regular presence at office hours, and they had long conversations, usually not about the coursework, but about other things having to do with the Democratic Party and Buttigieg thinking about it. At any rate, it's a really interesting read, so put that on your reading list. Astead, Warren. She was slow to start, then she got head of steam, then she ran into Medicare for All, and then she fell back. What is her route back?
Well, what they will tell you is that her route back is partly through the unclarity of the rest of the race, and that for whatever Buttigieg's gains in the first two states, for whatever Klobuchar's gains in New Hampshire, that when we look forward to the more diverse states, to Super Tuesday states, they have shown less pulse than Elizabeth Warren has. And that they think that they already have an organization in those states, they've already invested, and if they can keep up the money, which is a big if, to keep that afloat, that their organizing will pay off in that later route. So that is what they will tell you. To look at the delegates, she still came out of those two states, even while being shut out of the delegates in New Hampshire, she's still ahead of Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar, she's in third. That's the spin. It's unquestionably disappointing what happened in those first two states. She invested a lot of time and money into creating a structure in Iowa and New Hampshire, and frankly, it was thought to be the place that would create the kind of momentum that she would need to unlock the rest of the states. This was supposed to be her base, the white college-educated folks in Iowa, New Hampshire obviously being a neighboring state to Massachusetts, and that was not, that didn't happen. Now, if the question is why it didn't happen, I think there's a couple reasons. They have been kind of stubbornly on message, and they have rejected the suggestions of others, outsiders, people on their teams, to go on the offensive in ways that Klobuchar or Buttigieg has in these debates. And we've seen it pay off for those candidates, and she has not taken that opportunity. They also have kind of made this bet on unity that in the last 4 months of the race, after the kind of Medicare for All back and forth happened. And they thought that they could position themselves as the non-Bernie alternative that could unite both wings of the Democratic Party. And what we're seeing so far is that the people who needed to be motivated by that message just have not been. They have chosen Amy Klobuchar's kind of moderate consolidation. They've chosen Pete Buttigieg's kind of platitude-driven unity rather than the ideological-driven unity over hers. And if she does not correct that course, then this candidacy will not kind of reach the heights.
Do you think she locked herself in by the way she ran the campaign from when she started until she ran into the Medicare for All problem, that she is so identified as on the left, on the progressive wing, that the idea that she can now be a unity candidate is something that most voters struggle with that and look, as you suggest, to some of the others?
I think that that is an argument. I don't know if I would agree with that. I think that I think there was always going to be what ended up being a Medicare for All. There was always going to be an electability stand-in for Warren, but she needed to overcome. I think that there were things that proactively they could have done to kind of make that pivot not seem reactive to crisis, but seem as if they were striving that conversation that they did not do. They could have gone on the offensive in the debates and kind of driven how media should view her, made distinctions with Bernie Sanders that they have not decided to do. And so I don't think it was an inevitability that she would have to be grouped on the left and seen in the ways that she was. Certainly the campaign is progressive. I think they could have tried to they could have positioned in the same way that Buttigieg will talk about. It's not a choice between the moderate and the revolution. There's a different path. Elizabeth Warren could make that pitch. I mean, she has said that she's not she has disagreed with Bernie Sanders. When they asked the question in the last debate, do you worry about a socialist leading the ticket? She doesn't raise her hand. We know that she thinks that that label is politically unpopular. She could have chosen to raise her hand in that situation. And so I think there were just choices that have not been taken to this point. We've seen increasingly since that night, obviously in the New Hampshire kind of concession speech, she mentioned her rivals by name for the first time. Her ads are going at them directly. The question is now whether there is money to keep that going and whether the momentum has just shifted in a different direction. The only thing that gives them hope is that Buttigieg and Klobuchar show no pulse when it comes to those other communities in the way that she has to an extent, to a smaller extent.
We were all watching the last days in New Hampshire. Did any of you see Klobuchar really coming on the way she did? And if so, what were the indicators that you saw?
I was with her the day before the primary. There were overflow crowds. The proof is in we wrote a story talking about, about it happening and positioning her and her choice since the debate against Warren's and saying that was driving energy in a way that Warren was not. And so I'm not going to say I knew she was going to have 20%. I think the number was the shocking part. Yeah. But the idea that people were coming to her specifically because of that debate performance was one I think seemed evident on the ground. I think that there is a danger, though, in being narrative-driven completely from those first two states. The path for Amy Klobuchar's nomination still looks pretty bleak. The path for Pete Buttigieg's nomination still looks very difficult. And I think that although those first two states drive a kind of momentum question, who moderates are in Iowa and New Hampshire changes drastically when we get to Nevada and South Carolina, and those candidacies haven't shown traction with them.
Sean, what do you think the Klobuchar success in New Hampshire tells us about the voters?
I think it says a couple of things. One, that they are open to changing their minds. I think we're seeing in a lot of these exit polls a high number of voters deciding in the last few days. I actually talked to a voter in New Hampshire on Election Day who said she decided as she walked into the polling place and as she was walking into the voting booth to cast her ballot. So there's a lot of indecision here, and I think we see that reflected in past campaigns. We might not see somebody like an Amy Klobuchar be able to come on strong in New Hampshire after not doing particularly well in Iowa, after not being seen as a top candidate for a long time. So I think these voters, a lot of Democratic voters right now, are still shopping around. They're still uncertain about that central question which keeps coming up, which is who can defeat President Trump? Which one of these candidates is best equipped to do that? And I think it also reflects the idea of, if you have a moment, if you get hot at the right time, there's really no substitute for that. And you can put in a lot of the blocking and tackling and a lot of the work for months and months at a time. But some of that, sometimes is not worth as much as having a really strong debate performance or having a breakout moment at a rally or something of that nature. But I think it does underscore just how wide open and how flexible voters remain right now in the way that they view these candidates. The fact that they were willing to take a chance, about 20% of them in New Hampshire, on a candidate that really was not on the radar at all, right? This, Klobuchar candidacy was sort of premised on doing well in Iowa. She was the Midwestern candidate from the state next door who needed to have a good showing in Iowa, or that was going to be it for her campaign. Didn't happen. And she ends up doing well in New Hampshire, which sort of turns the entire idea of, these sort of paths and these sort of lanes that we've talked about kind of on their heads a little bit.
Yeah. I want to welcome Arlette.
Hi. Thanks for your patience.
We're glad you made it. We have not talked that much about the candidate that you've been following for a very long time. So give us an insight into the Biden candidacy. A couple of questions. One is, as you watched him, particularly in the last, let's say, 6 weeks, what did you see that were any clues as to how he ended up performing? And more importantly, what does he do now?
Well, I think the biggest difference right now is that from a year ago is that Joe Biden was the front runner heading into this, and now we have no idea where he stands. And his message has been so consistent over and over about electability, that he's the person who can take on and defeat President Trump. But what happens to the electability candidate when you suddenly can't win in these first few states and you finish pretty poorly? At his events, particularly in Iowa, he wasn't getting the large crowds that Bernie Sanders and others would attract to his events. One thing that I kind of saw as a little bit of a warning sign was in my conversations, either with voters or out at a restaurant in Iowa or at a shop, a lot of people said that they liked Joe Biden, but they weren't necessarily going to go caucus for whatever reason, be it health, be it having to work, some family obligation. And to me, about midway that last week that I spent in Iowa for the caucuses, about halfway through I realized this may not go very well for him. Going forward, I think you've seen him in New Hampshire. He's kind of got back to being, I don't want to say the old Joe Biden, but just a little bit more frank with his thoughts at times. And I think that that's something that they're really looking to capitalize on is Biden being Biden. Whether that's good or bad, I think that's for voters to decide. But when he was in New Hampshire, you did see him really sharpen his attacks on some of his rivals. But then the next day, he wasn't doing that. And so I think with Biden, part of the issue sometimes is consistency, and he's not always hammering away at the same message. And they're really looking, I think, as we all know, to South Carolina and Nevada as the opportunity for him to turn this around. While I was sitting in the airport, I got a little scoop that they're pouring more resources into those states because they know that those states are really going to be dependent for him if he needs to secure the path to this nomination. And I will say that having spent time with him in Nevada and in South Carolina particularly, sometimes the events in South Carolina feel a lot different than they do in Iowa and New Hampshire. There is an energy that's around him there that he didn't quite get in his reception from other states. And so that could be something that pushes him over the edge, but they certainly have a lot of work to do.
Have you gotten any indication of a change in message or a change in tactic, or do they just kind of double down on those two states, Nevada and South Carolina, and hope for the best?
Yeah, I think they have to double down there. That's really, if he ends up having a poor finish in South Carolina or a loss in South Carolina, I don't see any path really forward for him heading into Super Tuesday. He has argued for forever that South Carolina is going to be his firewall. And as far as messaging goes, I think I will see what he decides to turn to. But sometimes with Biden, keeping him on that consistent message doesn't always happen.
Yeah. Josh, you were with Mayor Bloomberg today, yesterday. Give us a sense of how they look at what has happened so far and the degree to which they think it is dramatically helpful to them. And then what's the caveat to that?
Well, I think that the dirty little secret about the Bloomberg campaign from the get-go has been that he benefits the messier the primary is. Because he made this decision to enter the race late, to completely cede the first 4 states and not compete there, that if we came out of the first 4 states and there was an obvious front runner who was, sort of walking away with this thing, that there would not be really an opening for him. He got a big gift from the Iowa Democratic Party in not being able to give us a clear winner at the beginning, as well as from New Hampshire, and the fact that there's this growing apprehension or anxiety within the party right now about Sanders, about the viability of in a general election if the race goes that way, and the way that he's set this up has created a situation where he's kind of in like a different contest, right? You've got all of the Democrats that are like running against each other, and then he's over here running against Donald Trump. And part of that is intentional because he's trying to project the image that he's already the nominee, right? It's all about me versus Trump, and you can sort of see him taking on Trump, these 2 rich New Yorkers who have been sort of national figures for a long time. But it's also just taken him out of the context of the discussion that we're having in the primary. He's not really getting asked as much about the other Democrats as he is about Trump. The other element of this is just the irony that we're in a time when the Democratic Party and the progressive base of the party in particular is very worked up about taking power back from millionaires and billionaires and reducing the role of money in politics. And one would think that would be a real problem for Bloomberg. And so far, I mean, I've been looking for the voter who is going to say, absolutely not. I will not support, someone who, is it's like the Amy Klobuchar argument. I don't think people look at Donald Trump and say, gosh, we need someone richer in the Oval Office. And yet, I think the anxiety about the prospect of Donald Trump getting reelected has sort of made that a lower priority. It's like, okay, maybe next cycle we can focus on having like our ideal, wonderful person who can carry all of our values forward. But like right now, we just get rid of Donald Trump, and maybe the super rich guy, you know, who knows how to handle him, is the best path for achieving that in the near term.
When he gets into the debates, which he will do, how will the other candidates deal with him? I mean, Arlette, how will Joe Biden deal with Michael Bloomberg? Will he go after him? Will he ignore him?
I mean, I think Joe Biden's very eager to have Michael Bloomberg on that debate stage with him. It's unclear. You know, Biden's style isn't to always go after other people, but you have seen him start to do that a little bit more. But you've heard from both Biden and his surrogates in the past few days that they feel like Michael Bloomberg is untested and that there is ample room for scrutiny for the former mayor. And their argument is that Biden's been scrutinized this entire time. He's been taking the attacks from people. And so it'll be interesting to see in the debates. I'm not so sure if Biden himself, sometimes, you know, his campaign previews what he's going to do a little bit better than Biden actually does himself in the debates. So they could try to present some arguments ahead of time. We'll see if Biden follows
Astead and Sean, I mean, the Warren campaign will have plenty to say about him if she chooses to do so, and you've suggested that very often she's not done that sort of thing. Do you think it'll be different with Bloomberg?
It has been already. Bloomberg is the candidate she is most willing to talk about by name, even today with the redlining comments that came out about Bloomberg. She's already tweeted about it, she's already made the pitch, and she's going to do that more consistently. I think that it's important to know where Bloomberg is trying to pull his support from. This is essentially Bloomberg and Steyer are looking toward that Southern black vote, the Super Tuesday vote, to be able to make inroads in terms of delegates. And that's going to be an interesting one. I think the funny part is black voters have been so determinative in the Democratic primary, partly because they voted as a bloc, and they were largely backing one candidate by big numbers. Even if Joe Biden wins in these states, but he's winning at a small percentage, that is not the Hillary Clinton firewall. That is not the Barack Obama firewall, and that will not give him the kind of delegate return that he would need to make that big leap. So even as Bloomberg and Steyer make these investments, it's not just the question, I think, of winning and losing, but one of the things the Warren campaign needed, the Buttigieg campaign needed, is for Biden to come down to earth with black voters. Not win by 30, 40 points, but win by, even if it's 5, 10 points, that's great news for Bernie Sanders, right? It makes that voting group less determinative than it's historically been. So there is a risk that this Bloomberg candidacy is a gift to Bernie Sanders. I think there is a risk that this Bloomberg candidacy, in kind of capitalizing on the chaos, lets the people who can pick off delegates here and there, particularly among white voters, among Latino voters, where he's stronger, those groups become more important. Because one of the things it's doing, we're seeing, particularly with the candidates who have invested so much ad money, is it is, and according to polling, obviously no one's voted yet, it seems to be splintering the black vote in a way that has not been true previously, and has not been true for what we saw for the entirety of 2019. If Joe Biden's at 25% and not 50%, that's bad news for him and great news for everybody else.
Yeah. Feel free to start lining up. I've got a few more questions I want to ask, but we'll turn to you shortly. Sean, does the Sanders campaign see Bloomberg's candidacy as good for him?
Well, when you look at the times that Bernie Sanders has seemed to have thrived, it's usually when he has a foil, a target, somebody he can go after and contrast himself with. And he had that for a long time with Hillary Clinton in 2016. And I think his campaign sees Bloomberg as that type of foil. And he's already starting to contrast himself with Bloomberg on the campaign trail. He's out there saying things like, this is not the time to have billionaires buying elections. This is not the time to have wealthy donors and people running for president controlling the decisions. He's very, very adamant as he campaigns, and he campaigns very proudly around the fact that he does not hold big fundraisers with donors, that he collects most of his money in small increments. And so I think they see Bloomberg as a candidate that can amplify their message, that can show voters why it is that Bernie Sanders is unique and gives him sort of one-on-one person to sort of mix it up with in the debate. So I think we would see, potentially the two of them mixing it up and potentially things getting pretty aggressive and pretty heated. We've already seen Bernie Sanders get worked up a lot when he talks about Bloomberg on the campaign trail. A few months ago when there was some talk about Bloomberg getting in, you could sort of hear in Bernie Sanders' voice the way that this sort of made him feel. It really, got him worked up in a way that I hadn't seen before. So this fundamental contrast about money in politics, which we are seeing now, I think, in this campaign in a way that we haven't seen before. Voters seem to care where money comes from. This is why we're having debates about wine caves and fundraising, and the word billionaire is being thrown around way more than we've ever heard it thrown around before. So I think from those perspectives, it gives the Sanders campaign the kind of contrast that they want to make to make him stand out in this field.
I want to spend a couple of minutes just getting a sense of what it has been like for you all to be on the road basically for the last year. The highs and lows, how you manage your life, and how you deal with the campaigns. Arlette, why don't you start with just a kind of a personal reflection?
Well, I spend the majority of my life either in an airport or waiting for Joe Biden, essentially. But I love being on the road, mostly because we have a front row seat to history and we're able to relay that to so many people and help people as they build their decisions about who they're going to elect as their next president. And also the fact that we get to talk to so many voters and hear what is on their minds and what's driving the decision. And I've also just encountered the kindest people. You forget that all across the country there are so many good people. There's this one woman that I met in Iowa even before Joe Biden was running, and she would bring me cookies and brownies at events, and that was nice. It kind of made you feel like you had a little bit of home, even though you were living out of a suitcase and going from hotel to hotel. But it certainly is a challenging job. You don't get a lot of sleep, and I feel like I'm constantly running with a cold and then getting some rest and then getting another cold. But I just think we're all so fortunate to have the opportunity to have this job and help people as they make their decisions about what they're going to do.
How do you manage the live shots and?
Yeah, so the TV aspect of it, and Josh knows this well too, it's a lot having to, so this is my third presidential cycle. I did it as a campaign embed, so that's the young people in their 20s who carry the cameras around and they're transmitting the video back. I did it as a producer for our White House, or the White House correspondent at ABC during 2016. But it's very different doing it when you have to be on TV and your makeup has to be right and your hair has to be right and you're trying to juggle making phone calls to sources and writing scripts and standing in front of the camera. Caucus night, I was essentially just tied to the camera for hours. So that's been a little bit of an adjustment, trying to balance all of that, but it's fun.
Sean, what about you?
Well, I've learned how to book flights on the way to the airport, book hotels literally on the way to the hotel. I've started timing exactly how long it takes to get from the plane to the rental car facility, and which airports are better for that and which airports are worse for that, and which
are
airports
the worst?
have the longest lines. Los Angeles is pretty tough.
Yeah.
Denver's tough. Manchester is a great airport. You can get out 6.5 minutes from, I think I've timed it, from deplaning to being in your car and on the road in Manchester.
It's always good when the rental facility you can just walk out,
Yeah.
but like here at Logan you have to
Shuttle,
get on a
forget
shuttle.
about it.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
that can that can throw off an entire trip. If you
Yeah.
have to get on a shuttle that takes longer than you expect, that can throw you off sometimes.
Sean, what about filing? When I started covering campaigns, there was one deadline a day or maybe two, and now it's constant. And our operation is demanding. Just the speed with which you are operating. How has that changed just in the several cycles you've been involved?
I think it's changed pretty dramatically. I think now that the deadline is whenever somebody makes news, the deadline is right then or 30 seconds later. And with Twitter, with social media, with people live streaming a lot of these events, there's an immediate demand, not just to report the news, but to also make sense of it and to tell people the significance of a moment. And you never know when a candidate is going to say something or do something or something is going to happen to them. And I think The biggest reminder about that for me is the heart attack that Bernie Sanders suffered in October, and the way that fundamentally changed his trajectory, the way that fundamentally changed the race. That was something that nobody saw coming. The campaign put out a press release in the middle of the morning, and I saw it on the screen, and I had to read it twice before I realized exactly what they were saying. And so it's moments like that where you realize literally anything can happen in this race that could immediately become a massive story, a big front page story, and a moment that begs explanation and understanding. And the added challenge here is in the Trump era, there's a lot of talk about fake news and misinformation and things like that. And there is a lot of misinformation that goes around on social media. There is a lot of conflicting information about candidates and campaigns sometimes. And there's also a need to kind of step back sometimes, take a breath, figure out what's real and what's not, make sure you do the reporting, make sure you check things out, and make sure that you're responsible about the way that you're telling these things to readers, and not just blindly firing off a story or a quote or a tweet or anything like that. So yeah, the deadlines are constant.
Josh?
I think maybe the best metaphor for life on the road is I haven't booked a round trip flight in a year, right? Because you never know what's coming the next day. So you can't. It's one way, and then you figure it out. As you said, on the way to the airport. There's two potential pitfalls in being candidate focused that I spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to guard against. One is that we all work at very competitive news organizations. It's a very competitive beat, and when you're covering a candidate, in a way, your own fate becomes tied to theirs, right? Because when your candidate is doing well, you're getting on television more, or you're getting on the front page, and you really have to guard against letting that in any way affect. I mean, when your candidate screws up and is doing poorly, that you got to tell that story as aggressively as you would tell any other story, and I think that that's something I think about a lot. And the other is the fact that because we're in this bubble where we're following a candidate around and we're spending a lot of time at their events, there's a selection bias in the people that we're talking to, right? So if you're at a Joe Biden rally and you're talking to and it's not like you have all of this time to go out and talk to people in the real world, because you can barely keep up with getting to all of these events. These candidates have ridiculous schedules, So if you're at a Joe Biden event and you're talking to the people there about who they're going to support, newsflash, probably disproportionately going to support Joe Biden. And so you really have to be very cognizant about trying to diversify the people that you're talking to make extra efforts to go away from candidate events and talk to people, also talk to people who are low information voters, right? Because not everybody who's going to vote is somebody who's, shopping around every single candidate and reading everything, and so you really have to, if you're going to be informed about the state of the electorate, sort of go above and beyond to make sure that you're hearing from people other than those who are immediately in front of you, despite the logistical challenges in doing that on a day-to-day basis.
So it's a very interesting point. In Iowa, I identified 6 or 8 people at the beginning of January who were undecided, and I met them at different events. You never meet an undecided voter at a Bernie event, basically. I mean, they're all decided, but for all the others. And I said, give me your phone number, I'm going to call you back just before the caucuses. And what I found was that almost everybody I talked to ended up with the candidate at whose event I first saw them, even though they said they were quite undecided and all that. What's been the most memorable moment for you over the last X months on this campaign in a personal way? I mean,
I just had my low moment this week. It's like, this is a personal low moment in that in the span of 24 hours, I left a book bag at one coffee shop. I left a credit card at another. My car ran out of gas on the highway because I was trying to do, not unsafely, but was thinking about multiple things at once and didn't actually realize the gas light was on. And then the car just Turns out the car needs gas. And then the next day, I got that same car towed. And it was just like, and there was a moment where I was like, you are crumbling, and you need to get your life together. But I think that, like,
How long ago was that?
this is literally 24 hours ago, so you tell me whether my life's together now. But I think
We're very glad you made it tonight.
Thank you. Yeah. Like, story-wise, I covered the Kamala Harris campaign also, and one of the things that, particularly as someone younger and doing this less time than you all have, is you see how quickly it can all end. And you've been thinking about this thing for a year, you've been writing about this thing for a year, and then just one day it's over. And it was one of those things that, like, kind of deeply informs how you move forward, is that there are signs you should pick up on the route, but you just never know when that call is going to Sean's point, when that call is going to come, where you're going to hear from that person, oh, she's dropping out. And for us, we had a sense it was not going very well. But to know that day and at that time was something that was so unique. She was scheduled to come to our editorial board for our editorial board interview in an hour. Where it was like there was not a real sense that it was going to be that immediate. And so I always think back to that moment to be the real, like, kind of informing point of just how shocking every day you wake up can be.
Yeah, great. Let's go to the audience. Again, name, rank, and serial number, and a question to anybody on the panel or all on the panel. You're first.
Hi, good evening. My name is Chuck. I'm a MPP student here at the Kennedy School. Question for everyone. In 2004 and 2012, the respective incumbents each earned about 50,000 votes in their respective New Hampshire primary. This year, President Trump earned 120,000 votes, so more than twice as much as President Obama and President Bush did in their respective New Hampshire primaries. Anecdotally, from what you've seen on the ground about support for President Trump, how do we explain that, and what lessons do we draw from that huge difference between 50,000 and 120,000?
Who wants to take that? Arlette?
I mean, I do think that President Trump is still incredibly popular. I think we all know that. You've seen that from the amount of people that attend his rallies. And you have seen, the president went into Iowa just a few days before the caucuses. He went into New Hampshire just the night before the primary. So it's very clear that he wants to get on his supporters' minds and try to drive them out, even if he is the only one that's on the ballot at this point. But it's certainly, there's a lot of people in the country who are still really fired up about the president, and I think that for Democrats going forward, as they're getting closer to the general election, they're going to have to also find ways to drive out their own supporters to try to counter that, and ultimately, if it goes their way, to defeat the president. I don't have anything super insightful to say about that.
Josh, let me ask you this. From as you've been covering the campaign and talking to voters and talking to candidates' teams, what is their view of President Trump as a general election candidate now compared to, let's say, before the whole impeachment thing started? Has there been a perception change in how formidable he may be, or is it? Oh, they always felt he was going to be tough to beat?
One of the things I thought was really interesting was there's always this divergence between the conversation in Washington and the conversation out in the country. The candidates really were not getting asked a lot about impeachment. It was not a real predominant thing on the minds of voters. And a moment I found really interesting was the Soleimani strike, when the president ordered this strike on the leader of the Quds Force in Iran, and it was this kind of, oh my God, we might be at the brink of war with Iran. The candidates, at least the ones I was covering, started getting more questions about that and the dangers of that than they were about, the impending impeachment of the president by the House of Representatives and possible removal from office. And I don't know what to make of that, other than that I think that most voters are kind of resigned to the fact that, you know, when it comes to sort of these, you know, that the president's very popular, and that when it comes to, you know, sort of these a political mechanism to remove him, like, that's probably not gonna happen, and that really the only path forward is election day. But even that, I don't hear a lot of Democratic primary voters who are particularly convinced that he's going to be defeated.
Yes, sir.
Hi, here we go. My name's JD. I'm a first year at the college here from Iowa, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm wondering, a lot of people have this perception that we live in a post-truth world. There's negative portrayals of the news, of news people in general. How does this affect your day-to-day lives on the campaign trail?
You want to try that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it doesn't not affect it, right? Like, I think that there are real challenges we have to overcome, particularly around trust in media. I think that that's true not only on the Republican side from the president's rhetoric that we know, but on the Democratic side, right? Like, there are real moments of distrust from kind of liberals around, like, media and its portrayal. Like, I guess I take the kind of longer term view here, where I don't think that's, I think like the megaphone and the rhetoric may be explicit, and I think that puts unique people in danger, so I don't want to dismiss that. But I also think from a kind of individual journalist role, your job has always been to win over trust, and that it doesn't really change. I mean, I am somewhat sympathetic to some of these communities. Media has done real harm. It's done real erasure. It's done bad things, right? Like, I used to write about crime in Boston for the Boston Globe, and I remember the biggest challenge was that going to those communities in which a bad thing has happened, what the newspaper did in those places has usually been bad, right? And so going there was an act not just to do that story, but to win those people over, that what the press's role there was something that they had a shared investment in. And so I think that kind of experience informs when I go to Trump rallies, when I go to Democratic rallies, and when you talk to other people, it is incumbent on you and us to win them. And I don't think I'm owed to people's thoughts and you know, feelings, whether it's about who they're going to vote for or whether it's about what happened in their community that day. And so I think that there is a unique moment in which the president and allies, and certainly even on Democratic politicians, have used media as a wedge for political gain. I don't think that's unique. I think we have some of that examples in the history of the country. Maybe this has been more explicit, sure. But I also think from our role, I can't speak for other folks, but from my role, I feel like that's the job. And, like, win them over and do your job.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I'm struck sometimes by when I go to these events and talk to voters that you know, when you introduce yourself and you tell them what you're doing, where you're from, they're very open to talking, and they'll often say things like, "Oh, I appreciate what you guys are doing. I know it's an important thing." And there is a lot of cynicism and criticism of the media, especially on, you know, social media and things like that. But I think when you get out in the country and you talk to people and you meet with them, there's an appreciation of, oh, you know, you're here to talk to us and to get the story from us, and you're not just telling your story from a desk or just what you're reading on Twitter or what you're seeing on TV. You're out here doing that, and I think people see that, and I think it goes a long way with them, and they appreciate that. And when you have these one-on-one conversations, you know, they tend to be different than the sort of mass conversations that you hear on social media or see sometimes. You know, going to Bernie Sanders events, I mean, Sanders is somebody who rails against the corporate media in a way that other candidates don't. He's a little bit more explicit about that. And there certainly is skepticism among a lot of his supporters about media. But I find that when you sit down and you talk to somebody on a one-on-one level and you interview them and you hear their thoughts, the conversation is often very, very different, and sometimes different than I think a lot of people expect.
Yes.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, my name's Shruti. I'm a senior here at the college studying government, also a fellow Iowan, so we got two in one room, quite unique. So I am curious to hear from your perspective what you saw as kind of the most significant challenges or failures of the media in 2016, especially when it comes to unevenness of coverage, and given that you all represent different media outlets, the ways in which you all have attempted to remedy those types of concerns and challenges, and whether you feel like you've done so adequately?
All right, we need a volunteer to take this question on.
I'll give it a stab, but I won't promise it will be super insightful. I think the biggest challenge is that despite all of the postmortems that we all did after 2016, no one has really put their finger on exactly what it is that we got wrong, right? No one's been able to say, okay, your algorithm where you take, polling and you looking at this and you're getting your impression from this, here's what we need to tweak, and then we'll be able to have a more predictive way to sort of sense what's happening in the country. And there's been different theories about that, but no one's really sort of diagnosed that in a way that has given people confidence that we can move forward with a better sense of what's actually happening. I think we all sense that there are a group of voters who do not, particularly who support the president, who do not show up in the typical ways that we are used to encountering them. They may not disclose their preferences to pollsters, or may not disclose them truthfully to pollsters. They may not be the people that we're out there that we're talking to when we go to campaign events, because they might not go to campaign events. And I think that we've tried to diversify the range of ways that we are gathering information about the electorate, but I don't think we have any real strong sense of whether that is getting us any closer until the next election.
Can I add one more? As I would say, there's also a need to diversify media itself, right? Like, there is a view of politics that's been ingrained in the profession partly because the progression has been dominated by particular voices. And I think that, like, one of the 2016 things that is evident is that there was real blind spots that came because of that, right? There's a blind spot in the GOP primary to Trumpism. There's a blind spot to Sanders. There's a blind spot to that kind of outside the traditional beltway view of politics that's really kind of a movement-driven type thing on the Trump side and on the Democratic side. And I think partly one of the things that media has to come to reckon with is that to adequately view that 360 lens, we have to do better at getting folks who are coming from different places, who look differently, who think differently, and that together that improves the entire journalistic report.
Good evening. My name is Brian Kaur. I live in Cambridge. I'm the immediate past chair of the Cambridge Democrats, which has given me time to volunteer. It feels like full time on one of the campaigns. And if you were observant, you might guess which one. But I have been canvassing up in New Hampshire since June, and the thing that has been most consistent has been the narrative of, I just want someone who can defeat the president. I want to beat Trump. We need to find someone who's electable. And I guess my observation is that it feels that it's really distorted the race. I've volunteered on many other presidential races, and I'm wondering, from your perspective as journalists who've engaged directly with voters, do you believe that this idea of electability has somehow transformed into this thing that's driving a narrative that really results in confusion? And is the idea of electability sort of something that has changed the nature of how people are making decisions? That instead of thinking about who they want to have as president or what the issues are, they're focused on this idea of an electability that it seems, to your last point, that they can't define, because they all thought they knew who was electable in 2016, and they think they have a blind spot. So I would love to hear any reactions to what is the role of electability in changing this race into something different from what we've seen before.
Arlette, could we start with you, just because that was the Biden?
Yeah, I mean, that's the center of the Biden argument that right now isn't holding up. I mean, we'll see how it goes on in further contests. But, I mean, you're exactly right. I feel like voters that I spoke to at these Biden events, I would ask them, what's your number one issue? And it would be someone who can defeat the president. But I think someone was talking about this a little bit earlier. I was listening in. They just can't put their finger on what exactly that is. And with Biden, they say, oh, you know, he's had the experience. He'll attract independents or some Republicans from states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. But for the most part, people really don't have a tangible, they can't wrap their minds around what that electability actually is. And I think that going forward, that is going to be a question. If this race was more based on healthcare specifically or foreign policy, if that was driving the decisions, could a candidate emerge and really coalesce people around that instead of relying on the electability factor?
I think one of the biggest phenomenons of voter attitudes this cycle is that voters are not only trying to decide what they think about electability, but they're playing pundit and they're trying to figure out, what does my neighbor think? What does my boss think? And so I hear that so often from voters. Yeah, I'd like to support this candidate, but I wonder if the people in my neighborhood are also going to vote for them. I wonder if they're going to rally around them, or if they're too polarizing, or if they're too old, or if they're too young. And I've never seen that before. I've never seen voters try to analyze what their friends, their neighbors, and others are thinking about it. And I think to Arlette's point, it speaks to this uncertainty. You can't really put your finger on it. I think for a lot of voters, they still can't fully articulate what it is that they're looking for in terms of electability. And each of these candidates is offering such a different theory of the case. You look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, his theory of the case is we need to activate new voters. We need to bring people out who haven't participated before. That's the way we beat Trump. But if you look at a Biden or a Pete Buttigieg or an Amy Klobuchar, their theory of the case is we're going to win back moderates. We're going to win back some of those suburban swing voters. That's the way that we beat Trump. And so there are so many different, fundamentally different theories about this flying around that I think there is sort of a lot of confusion and second guessing, again, not only of voters themselves, but of what their friends and others are going to do. And it's it sort of creates this cycle of uncertainty, which I think we were talking about earlier, which allows somebody like an Amy Klobuchar to do really well late in the race, even after having not done well anywhere before. The fact that these voters are still very, very open-minded about who they think is the most electable gives these candidates a shot. And I think it's why we're seeing candidates not drop out, because they're looking at this and say, hey, look, if I have one good debate, if I have one good finish in a primary somewhere, I could be right back in this thing. So there's really no incentive to drop out. There's less incentive than there was given this uncertainty that voters have about who is the most electable candidate.
Sir, you get the last question.
All right. My name is Randy Feldman. I'm an immigration lawyer and take courses at the Extension School. If Biden doesn't win South Carolina and get a lot of the black vote, and if Buttigieg and Klobuchar don't draw minority support in either of the two next primaries, is it now going to be Sanders versus Bloomberg?
Sean, what do you think?
It could be. I think there's so many variables about how things could turn out, and the way that people's opinions have changed, I think is pretty remarkable. If you look at polling, for example, in the last couple of weeks, and the ways, for a long time, it seemed like Biden had really, really strong, ironclad support among African-American voters that seemed kind of unshakable. And then he does poorly in Iowa, and it seems like that erodes almost overnight. The question is whether the opposite can be true. If you're somebody like a Buttigieg or a Klobuchar, and you haven't done well with non-white voters, if you start to, win or do better in some of these states, do non-white voters all of a sudden gravitate toward those candidates? I think that's an unanswered question at this point. And we haven't really seen Bloomberg tested in sort of the day-to-day that we've seen these other candidates tested. And when we get into the Super Tuesday states and when he's out there in the same places that these other candidates are, I think voters are going to start looking at him in a sort of side-by-side way that maybe they're not looking at him now. So I think there's a lot of variables about how this could shake out in the next few weeks.
Any last contributions from the rest of the group on that question?
Joe Biden needs to win South Carolina.
He needs to win.
Right?
And Nevada's going to be the first test of his diversity theory, his whole theory that he's going to appeal to a more diverse, broad electorate. And so he maybe doesn't have to win Nevada, but he needs to do well. He needs to do better than he did in New Hampshire to instill some confidence in people as he heads into South Carolina. But South Carolina could be what makes or breaks his candidacy at this point.
So this is the second of a series we started last fall, Tales from the Trail. Our goal has been to bring frontline reporters here to give their observations. The first one was terrific. Tonight, really, really rich conversation. We will continue this hopefully later in the spring and then into the fall. But I want to thank these 4 people who have given up their time and energy. And so, and thank all of you for coming. Have a good night.